Have you ever wondered how society was structured back in the Middle Ages? It wasn't like today with governments and elections. Instead, they had a system called feudalism. Imagine a giant pyramid, but instead of stones, it's made of people. This pyramid dictated everything: who had power, who had land, and who did all the work. It was the social and political backbone of medieval Europe for centuries. Today, we're going to climb that pyramid from the very bottom to the tippy top and figure out how this fascinating and often brutal system actually worked. So grab your metaphorical tunic and let's dive into the world of feudalism. At the very top of this pyramid, holding all the cards, was the monarch, the king, or queen. In theory, the monarch owned all the land in the kingdom, all of it. But here's the catch: a king can't personally manage millions of acres, command armies in every corner of the realm, and collect taxes from everyone all by himself. It's a logistical nightmare. So, what's a monarch to do? He delegates. He would grant large chunks of land, known as fiefs, to his most trusted and powerful supporters. These weren't just gifts, though. They came with strings attached, big ones. This brings us to the next layer down, the nobility. We're talking about dukes, counts, barons, the major players. These were the king's direct vassals. In exchange for their massive estates, they swore an oath of fealty or loyalty to the monarch. This oath was a huge deal. It meant they had to provide military service, typically for about 40 days a year. If the king decided to go to war, these nobles had to show up with a specified number of knights, fully armed and ready to fight. They also had to provide the king with money and advice, serving on his royal council. It was a give-and-take relationship. The king gave land and protection, and the nobles gave loyalty and soldiers. Now, these powerful nobles had way too much land to manage on their own, just like the king. So, what did they do? You guessed it, they delegated. They subdivided their own fiefs and granted smaller parcels to lesser lords, who we often call knights. This is the third tier of our pyramid. Knights were the backbone of the medieval army. They were professional warriors, trained from a young age in combat, horse riding, and the code of chivalry. In exchange for their land, which was often just enough to support themselves, their family, and their warhorse, a knight owed military service to his lord, the noble who granted him the land. So, when a king called his dukes to war, the dukes would then call their knights, and boom, an army was assembled. This cascading system of loyalty is the essence of feudalism. A knight was a vassal to a baron, who was a vassal to the king. So we have the king, the nobles, and the knights. They're all part of the ruling class. They controlled the land and held the military power, but who was actually working the land? Who was growing the food, making the clothes, and building the castles? That brings us to the very bottom, and by far the largest, layer of the pyramid, the peasants or serfs. About 90% of the population fell into this category. They were the engine that powered the entire feudal system. Serfs were not slaves, which is a common misconception. They couldn't be bought and sold like property. However, they weren't free either. A serf was tied to the land. They were born on a manor, they worked the manor's land, and they would die on the manor. They couldn't leave without the lord's permission. In exchange for a place to live and protection from bandits or rival lords, serfs had to work for their lord. A typical arrangement involved them farming the lord's personal fields, called the domain, for several days a week. The rest of the time, they could farm their own small plots of land to feed their families. But even then, they owed the lord a portion of their own harvest. They also had to pay fees for using the lord's mill to grind grain, his oven to bake bread, and his press to make wine. Essentially, their lives were a constant cycle of labor, with most of the fruits of that labor going upwards to support the layers of the pyramid above them. Life for a peasant was tough. They lived in simple, one-room huts with dirt floors, often sharing their living space with livestock. Their diet was basic, mostly bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables they could grow. Meat was a rare luxury, disease was rampant, and medical care was virtually non-existent. Yet they were the foundation. Without their labor, the knights couldn't afford their armor, the nobles couldn't fund their lifestyles, and the king couldn't maintain his kingdom. The entire glittering, chivalrous world of the medieval aristocracy rested squarely on the backs of the peasantry. This system, with its rigid hierarchy and complex web of obligations, was called the manor system, and it was the economic engine of feudalism. Each manor was a self-sufficient little world. It had its own fields, a village for the peasants, a church, and the manor house or castle where the lord lived. The lord of the manor was the law. He acted as the judge in local disputes and could levy fines and punishments. This decentralized power structure is a key feature of feudalism. While the king was the ultimate authority, day-to-day power was held by local lords all across the kingdom. So, let's recap our pyramid. At the top, the king, who theoretically owns everything. Below him, the powerful nobles, his direct vassals, who hold vast estates in exchange for military and financial support. Below them, the knights, vassals to the nobles, who provide the actual fighting force in exchange for their own smaller plots of land. And at the massive base of it all, the peasants and serfs, who are tied to the land and perform all the labor, supporting everyone above them in exchange for protection and a place to live. It was a system built on mutual obligation, flowing from the top down and the bottom up. Land was exchanged for service, and labor was exchanged for protection. But feudalism wasn't static. It evolved over hundreds of years and eventually began to break down. Several factors contributed to its decline. The Black Death in the mid-14th century wiped out a huge portion of the population. Suddenly, labor was in short supply. Peasants who survived could demand better wages and more freedom. Some lords, desperate for workers, began to offer payment instead of land, and serfs started to become tenant farmers who paid rent. The rise of towns and a merchant class also created new opportunities. A serf could potentially escape to a town and, if they remained for a year and a day, could become a free person. Furthermore, the nature of warfare changed. The introduction of new weapons like the longbow and, later, gunpowder and cannons made the armored knight on horseback less effective. Kings started to prefer professional, paid armies mercenaries that were loyal directly to them, rather than relying on their sometimes unreliable nobles. This centralized power back in the hands of the monarch. As trade grew and a money-based economy replaced the land-based one, the old feudal contracts became less relevant. The pyramid, which had defined medieval life for so long, began to crumble. Understanding feudalism is key to understanding the Middle Ages. It shaped politics, warfare, and the daily lives of millions. It was a system of control, a system of survival, and a system of deep inequality. But it also provided a sense of order and stability in a very chaotic time. That pyramid of power, with the king at its peak and the peasants at its base, was the framework upon which a new Europe would eventually be built. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this journey back in time interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more dives into history. Let me know in the comments what other historical systems you'd like to see broken down. Until next time, stay curious.